In Southern California's Simi Valley, most 911 calls end with minor accidents or noise complaints, certainly not homicide units. But at 8:24 p.m. on November 10th, 2022, a panicked call came in from a young woman reporting a lot of blood inside her shared apartment. Her voice was steady but strained, the kind of tone dispatchers learn to recognize. Not panic, but dread. The caller was 23-year-old Emily Castillo. She had just come home from work to find the front door unlocked, the lights off, and the eerie stillness of a home that should have been occupied. Her sister, Rachel Castillo, 25, wasn't answering her phone. Her purse, keys, and car were in the driveway. But the silence wasn't the issue. It was what was inside. Blood, on the floor in the hallway, splashed across the walls like a scene paused mid-violence. Emily didn't need to check the bedrooms to know something had gone terribly wrong. She backed out immediately and called police. Patrol was dispatched in under 2 minutes. By 8:32 p.m., the first officers arrived at the complex off Country Club Drive. Their initial report was cautious but clear. Signs of significant blood loss, possible critical injury or worse, scene preserved. Simi Valley detectives secured the perimeter and called in forensics. Officers noted no signs of forced entry. The living area was undisturbed. No broken glass, no toppled furniture. Rachel's phone lay charging on the kitchen counter. Her ID and wallet were still in her purse, placed neatly by the entryway. Her SUV, a white Toyota, sat idle in the front lot. But then came the pattern. Bloodstains visible even to the naked eye. A wide arterial spray originating from the living room area. Partial smears leading down the hallway toward the bathroom. One broad enough to suggest dragging. This wasn't a minor accident. This was something else. Forensics began luminol sweeps by 10 p.m. It lit up the floors in almost every room. One technician later described it as a full-body event, not survivable without medical intervention. Preliminary DNA tests on scene confirmed the blood matched Rachel's profile from state health records. Detectives canvassed neighbors. No one heard screams. No sounds of a struggle, just silence. Rachel had been seen earlier that morning, around 8:09 a.m., dropping her 2 young sons at the home of her ex-husband per custody arrangements. According to Emily, Rachel had returned home by 9 a.m. That was the last time anyone heard from her. Her disappearance was now classified as a suspicious missing persons case with signs of possible homicide. The following 12 hours involved a full-scale response, door-to-door interviews, security camera pulls from neighboring apartments, and a digital forensics warrant for Rachel's devices. But the silence of the scene continued to pose a problem. There were no broken locks, no missing valuables, no signs of a forced exit. It didn't look like someone had come in violently. It looked like someone had been comfortable or familiar. One investigator noted, "There's something off when a scene is both chaotic and clean. Either it was staged or someone took their time." Meanwhile, digital forensics on Rachel's phone revealed no outgoing messages after 9:05 a.m. Her last known activity was a text to her sister. "I'm back, all good." That was it. No social media use, no app activity, no outgoing calls. By Friday morning, November 11th, the media had caught wind of the case. Headlines read, "Young California mother missing after apparent crime scene found." The photo used was from her graduation, Rachel smiling, holding her baby boy. The community response was swift. Vigils were organized. Volunteers offered to assist in searches, but police advised against civilian interference. There was no designated search area yet. No body, no weapon, no suspect. Internally, the case was escalated to major crimes by noon. Detectives began drafting subpoenas for GPS metadata, traffic camera logs, and financial transactions. They noted a critical detail. Rachel's bank card had not been used since the previous night. If she was alive, she wasn't mobile. If she was dead, someone had worked fast. At the police briefing that afternoon, the case supervisor summarized it in 8 cold words. Too much blood. No Rachel. No noise. That's deliberate. Investigators didn't say it out loud, but they were thinking it. This wasn't random. This was personal. Rachel Castillo was not an unknown name in Simi Valley. At 25 years old, she was active in her community, a graduate student in clinical psychology, and a devoted mother of 2 young children. Her face, kind, clear, composed, was one many recognized from parent workshops, church gatherings, or therapy support circles she facilitated through a local nonprofit. She wasn't just building a career, she was rebuilding a life. Her academic records showed consistent enrollment at Pepperdine University, where she was pursuing her master's in clinical psychology with a focus on marriage and family therapy. According to her academic advisor, Rachel had completed all coursework for the semester and was preparing for finals. She was in good standing and scheduled to graduate the following year. No absences, no disciplinary issues, no signs of a life about to derail. Investigators began the standard process of constructing a psychological and logistical profile of the victim. What she did, who she saw, how she lived. From text history to calendar syncs, Rachel's life appeared methodical. She kept a consistent routine: morning drop-offs for her children, work-from-home counseling blocks, afternoon grocery runs, and evening video lectures. Her phone records showed regular communication with family, university contacts, and clients. No flagged threats, no previous reports of domestic issues on record. Still, homicide protocol doesn't rely on surface-level peace. Investigators reviewed Rachel's social and relational history with sharper scrutiny. She had divorced her husband just over a year prior. The dissolution of the marriage had been filed without contest. Custody was split. According to friends, there was no drama. But what stood out wasn't what people said. It was what they didn't say. In interviews, several close acquaintances hesitated when asked about Rachel's relationship with her ex-husband. Words like strained, tense, or complicated surfaced repeatedly, but without elaboration. One friend, a fellow church member, stated, "She didn't talk badly about him, but she didn't talk about him at all, not in any real way." Another added, "She just wanted stability for the kids. She didn't want to fight." That restraint stood out to detectives. It wasn't anger, it was distance. In the week before Rachel vanished, her Google Calendar showed several crossed-out events labeled meeting or pickup. Investigators noted that one event, originally scheduled for Friday morning, was removed entirely. Digital forensics flagged a deletion of messages between Rachel and one number now marked in the system as a person of interest. The deletion occurred midday Thursday, Rachel's last full day alive. A warrant was obtained for full message recovery. Initial previews suggested emotionally loaded communication. One exchange read, "Rachel, I don't want to keep doing this every week. I'm tired." Response, "You agreed. Don't start changing the rules now." No explicit threats, but the tone had changed. Meanwhile, forensic techs analyzed Rachel's devices further. They found that while her phone had stopped sending signals after 9:05 a.m. Thursday, a secondary device, an iPad registered to her iCloud account, pinged from the apartment as late as 11:47 a.m. That created a discrepancy. The iPad showed the home Wi-Fi remained active well into the afternoon, even though Rachel's phone was silent. At 12:02 p.m., the Wi-Fi connection dropped. Investigators noted this timestamp and cross-referenced it with building access logs. Though the complex didn't use keycard access, surveillance from a nearby property across the street recorded vehicular movement at approximately 12:08 p.m., a white SUV departing the lot. It was the same make and model as Rachel's car. That vehicle was still in the driveway when officers arrived later that evening. This suggested a second matching vehicle, unregistered to Rachel, may have been used in the window after her last known activity. A vehicle that left no trace except a single, indistinct security camera frame. Detectives requested enhanced processing from the Ventura County Crime Lab. In the background, family members were brought in for official statements. Emily Castillo, her younger sister, confirmed Rachel had voiced concerns recently about feeling watched and needing more space, though she hadn't specified from whom. Rachel had not filed any restraining orders. No one she knew had a record of violent behavior. There was nothing actionable, only implication. In forensic work, implication is noise until evidence speaks. But implication becomes context. And by day 3, context was beginning to narrow. Her work colleagues described her as professional but reserved, especially in the last month. She was focused but distracted, like she was keeping something to herself. One supervisor recalled that Rachel had asked to switch her schedule in the last week, citing personal reasons. That request now sat under review in the investigative folder. There was no history of mental illness, no financial distress, no travel plans, no insurance adjustments, nothing that would indicate a motive to disappear voluntarily. Rachel's bank account had not been touched. Her last debit transaction was Wednesday morning, 7:36 at a gas station less than a mile from her home. Her card had not been used since. That kind of silence, in behavior, in financial movement, in digital trace, is often more telling than activity. A human being doesn't vanish without ripple effects. But in Rachel's case, the absence itself was the pattern. No struggle, no sound, no signs of force. Just quiet, missing data, and an apartment that felt too intact. Detectives circled one phrase from an early interview with Emily. She kept her life so carefully in place. If anything knocked it over, it had to come from inside. By the third day of Rachel Castillo's disappearance, the investigation shifted focus from static forensics to dynamic movement. Detectives needed to establish a precise timeline, not just for Rachel's last known moments, but for the window in which her apartment turned from lived-in to crime scene. In homicide work, it's rarely about what happened. It's about when and who had time to do it. Using digital forensics, phone pings, and device logins, the team reconstructed the start of Rachel's day on Thursday, November 10th, 2022. At 7:51 a.m., her phone connected to a known Wi-Fi network in the area of her ex-husband's home in a neighboring suburb, indicating she was dropping off her children per their usual custody routine. At 8:07 a.m., her phone disconnected from that network and reconnected to her home Wi-Fi at 8:41 a.m. Investigators confirmed this via router logs obtained through subpoena. It placed Rachel back inside her apartment before 9:01 a.m. At 9:03 a.m., Rachel sent a text to her sister Emily. "I'm back, all good." That was the last outbound activity from her phone. No further calls, texts, or app activity was recorded beyond that point. What followed was silence, digitally and physically. Investigators noted this time gap with urgency. From 9:05 a.m. to 12:02 p.m., nothing from Rachel's devices. Then at exactly 12:02 p.m., her home Wi-Fi cut off. According to network logs, the modem was powered down or disconnected. That became a pivot point in the case. The apartment had been alive with data traffic. Suddenly, it wasn't. At 12:08 p.m., a vehicle was seen exiting the lot by a neighboring business's surveillance camera. The timestamp aligned with the modem disconnect. The vehicle was consistent with the dimensions of a white Toyota SUV, matching Rachel's make and model. But Rachel's actual vehicle remained untouched in the driveway when police arrived later that evening. This led to a forensic inquiry into the possibility of a duplicate vehicle, similar make, different plate, or a swapped vehicle scenario. Law enforcement distributed a request for surveillance footage from all businesses along the primary exit routes in a 5-mile radius. The goal wasn't identification, it was location anchoring. Meanwhile, crime scene analysts returned to the apartment to search for transfer evidence. Soil, tire treads, any trace of movement that could link to the unknown vehicle. What they found was minimal. The apartment's flooring showed slight trace particulate, silicate consistent with dried sand or desert sediment. Not a lot, but enough to send in for comparison. The presence of desert silicate in suburban Simi Valley raised flags. There was no logical reason for it to be there, unless someone or something had been in a dry, undeveloped area recently. This became the investigation's next actionable clue. Detectives began interviewing residents in the complex, this time with a tighter focus. They asked about unusual traffic, specific vehicle descriptions, and exact timing of movement in the parking area. One neighbor reported hearing what she described as something heavy being dragged shortly after 11:30 a.m., but dismissed it as furniture being moved. When pressed for detail, she could only recall the sound came from above or next door. She wasn't sure. Detectives noted that sound profiles in multi-level apartments can distort vertical versus horizontal origin. Still, the timing was significant. 12:02 p.m., network silence. 12:08 p.m., vehicle departure. 11:30 a.m., sound of weight displacement. This compressed the timeline further. Based on forensic blood pattern analysis and trajectory data from the scene, medical examiners estimated time of fatal injury between 9:15 and 10:45 a.m. That lined up with the window. But one gap remained. Where did the body go? At that point in the investigation, Rachel's body had not been recovered. No public alerts had been issued, but internally, law enforcement was treating the case as a suspected homicide with disposal. It was no longer just a missing persons case. The next step was geolocation triangulation. Digital forensic specialists pulled cell tower records for all devices that interacted with Rachel's phone number or Wi-Fi from 8:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. Thursday. A short list of numbers pinged in and out of the coverage zone. Some were consistent with delivery drivers and resident devices. One stood out. It moved from Rachel's block to a remote section of the Antelope Valley Desert in less than an hour. Then it stopped transmitting. A warrant was requested for the subscriber data behind that number. In the meantime, search and rescue teams were assembled for a grid-based search in the Antelope Valley region. The area was vast, arid scrubland, ravines, limited cell coverage. But investigators had narrowed down a 3-mile radius based on the signal arc. The plan was to deploy drones and ground units within 48 hours unless new information redirected focus. What made the case more complex wasn't the lack of evidence, but the precision of its absence. The apartment hadn't been ransacked. There were no digital traces beyond the Wi-Fi cut. The body was missing, but so was any sign of panic or hasty retreat. It was as if the perpetrator had operated with clarity, too much clarity. As one detective quietly noted in the case file, the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. The Antelope Valley Desert isn't a convenient place to lose a body. It's vast, over 3,000 square miles of dry basins, ridge lines, and decomposing scrubland. But it is familiar to law enforcement in Southern California. When bodies disappear in Ventura or Los Angeles County, this is where many turn up. The terrain is unforgiving, the cell reception weak, and foot traffic rare. That makes it ideal for someone who wants to leave a body where time, not people, will find it. On November 13th, 3 days after Rachel Castillo was reported missing, search teams from multiple agencies arrived at a staging zone near the intersection of East Avenue J and 140th Street East. This location wasn't random. It was chosen based on cell tower triangulation data tied to a device previously flagged during the digital sweep of Rachel's last contacts. That phone pinged at the Castillo residence, moved northeast along the 14 freeway corridor, and stopped transmitting somewhere in the unincorporated outskirts of Lancaster. The movement ended in a signal dead zone. Search and rescue coordinators divided the area into gridded blocks. Volunteers weren't involved. This was a controlled effort, limited to law enforcement and trained cadaver dog units. The risk of disturbing or contaminating potential evidence was too high. At approximately 2:17 p.m., one of the canine handlers signaled a hit. The dog, trained specifically for human remains detection, alerted near a shallow depression partially obscured by tumbleweed and gravel wash. The soil had been disturbed, not freshly, but recently enough for patterns to remain under thermal scan. Detectives on scene secured the perimeter, and forensic technicians began controlled excavation. Within 30 minutes, investigators uncovered partial remains, later confirmed to be a deceased adult female. The body was covered in a plastic tarp and loosely packed with dry soil. No formal burial, no effort to disguise decomposition. It wasn't a ritual. It was disposal. The condition of the body matched what investigators feared. Visible trauma, evidence of stabbing wounds, and early signs of decomposition consistent with being exposed for several days. Identification wasn't announced publicly yet, but investigators moved forward with urgency. Dental records were requested. A rush DNA comparison was ordered against samples collected from Rachel's apartment. By the next morning, confirmation was received. The remains belonged to Rachel Castillo. Autopsy began immediately under the supervision of the Ventura County Medical Examiner's Office. Preliminary findings indicated sharp force trauma to the upper torso, with 3 deep incisions near the left clavicle and upper sternum. There was no evidence of defensive wounds. This detail mattered. It supported the theory that the attack had been sudden, possibly from behind, or that Rachel had been caught off guard with no opportunity to react. Toxicology reports were initiated but were not expected to reveal significant findings. Rachel had no known history of drug use, and no signs of ingestion-related cause of death were observed externally. The absence of defensive injuries and the nature of the wounds pointed to an ambush or premeditated attack. At the burial site, additional forensic attention focused on transfer evidence. Samples of dirt, fabric fibers, and trace biological material were collected. Shoe prints were minimal and degraded, but tire tracks, shallow and wide set, were visible on the access path. Impressions were documented and cast. Analysts later identified the tread as consistent with mid-size crossover SUVs, matching the general category of vehicle last seen leaving Rachel's apartment complex. One item recovered a few feet from the body provided a small but significant clue. A plastic grocery bag bearing a store logo from a chain located near Rachel's residence. Inside was a used latex glove, loosely balled. It tested positive for type A blood, the same as Rachel. A partial fingerprint was lifted from the inside cuff. That print was sent for expedited comparison. Back at the precinct, detectives met to reassess the broader profile of the case. What had started as a disappearance had now formally escalated to a confirmed homicide with body recovery and forensic confirmation of trauma. But crucially, no suspect had been publicly named. Investigators were operating under strict containment. Media reports remained vague. Missing California mother found deceased in desert. In internal documents, the case was now classified as a primary homicide. Investigators reviewed all physical and digital evidence collected to date, now matching scene to scene. Rachel's blood at the apartment. The Wi-Fi shut down at 12:02 p.m. The exit of a vehicle matching hers at 12:08 p.m. Silicate particles from desert soil found in her apartment. Signal movement of a device from her apartment to Antelope Valley. Each point, standing alone, proved little, but the combined weight of it created a forensic chain that was hard to ignore. A case doesn't need to rest on motive when it has method. What remained was to prove who had access to that method and how they used it. Behind the files and evidence logs, the reality was harsher. Rachel was gone. Her family would not get answers that made sense. What they would get, instead, was the truth, delivered piece by piece, through data, fiber, and bone. The desert didn't keep it secret for long, but it had already kept it long enough. 3 days after Rachel Castillo's remains were recovered from Antelope Valley, the case pivoted. This was no longer a question of if foul play occurred. It was now about narrowing who had the access, knowledge, and time to make her disappear, and why they assumed they wouldn't be caught. The forensic chain had begun to close. Blood in the apartment, desert soil found near the bathroom doorway, tire tracks at the recovery site, and now 2 critical new developments: a fingerprint lifted from the interior cuff of a latex glove and an expanding digital trail from one mobile device. The print came back as a partial match in the national AFIS database. Not enough for public identification, but enough for probable cause and context. Investigators were already narrowing the list to individuals with known proximity to Rachel's apartment and those with legal or domestic ties. Meanwhile, cellular records tied to a single subscriber ID had traced a near-perfect mirror of the digital route Rachel's body had taken, from her home's Wi-Fi disconnect to the final cell tower hid in the desert. While the phone had since been powered off, geolocation timestamps were preserved. Cross-referenced with security camera data, the device appeared in proximity to Rachel's apartment complex just minutes before the Wi-Fi signal cut off. That sequence, home arrival, network silence, and desert location, formed a path too tight to ignore. The suspect's phone number, registered under a legal name and verified via carrier subpoena, belonged to someone known to investigators from the early stages of the case. That individual had submitted to an informal interview on day 1 and had maintained no contact with Rachel that day. That statement now stood in direct contradiction to cell tower records. Further inconsistencies emerged when comparing vehicle plate reads gathered from the city of Simi Valley's traffic cams. A vehicle of matching make, model, and wheelbase to Rachel's was identified heading northbound at 12:14 p.m., less than 15 minutes after the Wi-Fi blackout at her residence. However, this vehicle bore a different license plate, later discovered to be temporarily registered to a rental agency which had no rental logs in Rachel's name. Police traced the plate to a rental obtained under an associate of the primary person of interest. A secondary search warrant was issued. The rental company provided GPS logs from the vehicle's onboard system, confirming the same route to Antelope Valley, with two unexplained stops, one in a grocery store lot and another at a car wash. Both locations had cameras. At the grocery store, a male figure matching the physical profile of the POI was seen exiting the vehicle with what appeared to be a box of cleaning supplies and gloves. Investigators captured stills from the footage. No facial ID, but the clothing matched surveillance from the earlier visit to Rachel's complex. No other occupants were visible. That was enough to bring the case to its next phase. Internal memos described the situation as ready for warrant execution and preliminary charging, pending DA review. In a parallel forensic update, the glove retrieved from the crime scene tested positive for not only Rachel's blood, but also a second DNA profile consistent with the POI. The sample was partial, but considered admissible for prosecutorial use, supported by the fingerprint on the glove cuff. The convergence of digital movement, biological evidence, and inconsistencies in testimony created a clear direction forward. But even as evidence mounted, detectives took pause. This wasn't a complex kill. It wasn't sophisticated. It was executed quickly, with minimal cleanup and no long-term concealment. That suggested something else. Rage, not calculation. The type of crime that escalates in minutes, not weeks. Statistically, in intimate partner homicides, this pattern is consistent. Opportunity, isolation, and an emotional trigger. Rachel had communicated boundaries in the days leading up to her disappearance. The timeline indicated confrontation, not abduction. For law enforcement, this raised another layer of responsibility, ensuring the safety of any children connected to the victim. Protective measures were enacted quietly. No media leaks, just quiet procedural safeguards while the legal system began to shift. In the briefing room, a detective summarized the case status in one sentence. We're past questions. Now it's just the evidence making its way to court. The arrest warrant was executed at 6:42 p.m. on November 15, 2022, without incident. The suspect was located at a family residence in Victorville, California, roughly 90 miles northeast of the original crime scene. Local law enforcement coordinated with Ventura County Sheriff's Department to perform the operation with minimal public exposure. The suspect was cooperative, calm according to the arresting officers. There was no attempt to flee, no resistance. That detail, while procedural, would later become a point of scrutiny during trial preparation. Immediately following the arrest, a parallel search warrant was executed on the suspect's vehicle and two electronic devices seized during initial contact. The forensic team prioritized the phone. While previously disabled, it was now unlocked under a new warrant, and a partial image recovery revealed cache location logs and deleted messages from November 10th. Among them, one outgoing draft, unsent, contained only 6 words. I didn't mean for this. The DA's office reviewed the evidence chain within 24 hours of the arrest. Based on the culmination of biological, digital, and testimonial inconsistencies, the official charge was filed. 1 count of murder in the first degree, with special circumstances of domestic violence and body concealment. During interrogation, the suspect waived counsel initially, but later requested representation mid-session. Prior to that, he acknowledged having contact with Rachel on the day of her disappearance. When confronted with the digital trail, he remained silent. When asked directly whether he had transported Rachel's body to Antelope Valley, he asked for a lawyer. Silence in these situations isn't obstruction, but combined with forensic evidence, it often becomes as meaningful as a confession. Forensic analysts presented their findings in a compiled briefing submitted to the DA. The timeline was no longer speculative. It had sequence and corroboration. 08:41 a.m. Rachel reconnected to her home Wi-Fi. 09:03 a.m. Last confirmed message sent. 10:30 a.m. Estimated time of death based on blood coagulation and lividity onset. 12:02 p.m. Wi-Fi disconnect. 12:08 p.m. Security footage logs vehicle departure. 2:45 p.m. Cell tower ping in Antelope Valley. 3:22 p.m. Device goes dark. The suspect's movements followed the same sequence. No other individual in Rachel's network showed a pattern that matched. At the same time, lab results from the latex glove found near the burial site were finalized. Beyond the partial print, mitochondrial DNA confirmed a match to the suspect through maternal lineage tracing, a method often used when nuclear DNA is insufficient. While not individually unique, in context with the other identifiers, it contributed to a weight of evidence considered prosecutable by California statute. The apartment was re-examined a final time with luminol respray. A new technician, assigned post-arrest, confirmed previously unseen patterns behind the bathroom wall. Small smears likely missed during the initial pass. These were photographed, preserved, and added as reinforcement. It suggested an attempt to clean, not fully executed. The working theory was simple and backed by behavioral analysis. The killing had not been premeditated in the legal sense, but the disposal was. The delay between death and movement, the organized steps taken to obscure the body's location, and the absence of panic were indicative of a post-homicide strategy, not a spontaneous emotional collapse. The arrest was not announced to the public immediately. Out of respect for the victim's children and the family, the Ventura County Sheriff's Office withheld official media release until after charges were confirmed and the arraignment scheduled. Internally, however, the case was considered airtight. There was no need to pressure for a confession. There was no urgency to explain motive in headlines. That would come in court. From the outside, it looked clean. A suspect arrested, a body found, a charge filed. But the damage, as always in cases like this, wasn't visible. The children Rachel left behind would grow up with court transcripts instead of memories. Her parents would spend years in hearings. And the community, once quietly supportive, would begin to ask harder questions about signs missed, warnings not acted on, and what safe really means in the context of shared custody. Sometimes what makes these cases most painful isn't the brutality, it's how ordinary the buildup was. On December 5, 2022, the arraignment was held at Ventura County Superior Court. The defendant stood formally charged with first-degree murder, with special allegations tied to domestic violence and the intentional concealment of a body. Bail was denied. Prosecutors cited the flight risk, the integrity of the digital evidence, and the degree of pre- and post-crime planning. The courtroom was quiet. There were no outbursts, no visible emotion. Rachel's parents sat in the front row. The media was present, but restricted. Cameras weren't allowed inside. Only notepads and recorders were permitted. This wasn't a case built for headlines. It was built for trial. The pre-trial phase began with evidence disclosure. Over 100 to 200 pages of forensic documentation, timestamp location data, and scene analysis reports were entered into record. The defense filed an initial motion to suppress key GPS data from the rental vehicle, citing chain of custody irregularities. The motion was denied. The judge found the digital logs intact and properly authenticated. The prosecution moved to establish a forensic timeline, requesting early admission of digital evidence to streamline proceedings. They emphasized the consistent progression of Rachel's last known activities, the suspect's GPS movement, and the recovery location of her body. The court allowed limited scope usage, conditional on cross-examination at trial. Witnesses began to be prepped. Emily Castillo, Rachel's sister, was among the first called to pre-trial interviews. She reviewed communication logs, identified Rachel's voice in call recordings, and helped contextualize the tone of messages exchanged in the weeks before her disappearance. Her testimony wasn't about guilt. It was about pattern, about Rachel trying to set boundaries and someone refusing to accept them. Detectives who worked the case prepared a step-by-step reconstruction. Their presentation was chronological, from Wi-Fi disconnect to vehicle movement to body recovery. It was built not on theory, but on matching signals. Data that moved through real time, following actions too specific to be coincidental. The defense remained quiet publicly. Their strategy focused on alternative interpretation, that the killing wasn't premeditated and that someone else might have had access to the apartment. But they didn't name an alternative suspect. There was no competing timeline, just doubt, thin, unanchored, but legally admissible. At a procedural hearing 2 weeks later, the prosecution entered a new piece of evidence. Metadata from a deleted audio memo on the defendant's phone, time-stamped hours after Rachel was believed to have died. The file was incomplete, corrupted by overwrites, but the final line remained recoverable. "It's not what I planned, but it's done." In total, the pre-trial phase lasted 5 weeks. The court set a trial date for early spring 2023. Jury selection would begin in March. Outside the courthouse, a small memorial remained near the entrance. A framed photo of Rachel with her sons, and a note handwritten by one of them, barely able to spell yet. It simply said, "Miss you, Mommy." The court would focus on facts, but outside the courtroom, the absence was human and permanent. The trial of People versus Zarbab Ali commenced in March 2023 at the Ventura County Superior Court. Jury selection was complete within 4 days. 12 seated jurors plus 2 alternates were tasked with reviewing over 2 months of investigative work and determining if the prosecution's evidence met the legal standard for first-degree murder. There were no cameras in the courtroom, no grand speeches, just a sequence of facts methodically presented by the state. Opening statements from the prosecution laid out the core of their case. Motive rooted in resentment, opportunity due to shared custody, and a digital trail that connected the suspect's physical movements to the disposal of Rachel Castillo's body. They didn't rely on emotion. They relied on sequence, data, and science. Wi-Fi disconnect, vehicle movement, GPS logs, blood evidence, DNA in the glove, the suppressed voice memo. No speculation, just progression. The defense challenged method, not motive. They did not deny that the defendant had contact with Rachel. They did not dispute that his phone moved across county lines. What they contested was premeditation. They offered the possibility of a confrontation escalating, of a moment lost to control. They asked the jury to consider whether this was murder or a tragedy. But the forensic evidence didn't leave room for ambiguity. Witnesses testified in clear terms. Rachel's body showed no signs of a defensive struggle. The cleanup was partial, not panicked. The route to Antelope Valley was direct. The burial was hidden but rushed. And the digital record, once erased, now told its own story. Detective Lindsay Alvarez, lead investigator, summarized it in her sworn statement. He had over 2 hours to change his mind. He didn't. That's not panic. That's intent. Emily Castillo testified on the third day. She spoke briefly, clinically. She confirmed Rachel's routines, the last message sent, and the abnormality of silence. Her presence was understated but precise. Her role wasn't to prove guilt. It was to establish who Rachel was and what was stolen from her sons. On day 6, the medical examiner presented autopsy photos and findings. Cause of death, sharp force trauma, 3 deep wounds. No defensive injuries, no drug involvement. Death likely occurred within 90 minutes of Rachel arriving home. No alternate cause proposed. The defense attempted a final pivot, an argument that the burden of proof had not been fully met, that the glove might have been planted, that GPS data could be misinterpreted. But under cross-examination, their forensic consultant admitted the digital path was highly unlikely to result from anyone other than the person under arrest. Closing arguments were brief. The prosecution restated the timeline. The defense asked for leniency in judgment, not because the facts weren't there, but because they were. Deliberation lasted 4.5 hours. The verdict, guilty. First-degree murder. Special circumstances. Life without the possibility of parole. When the sentence was read, the courtroom remained silent. Rachel's parents held hands. The defendant stared forward. No tears. No reaction, just finality. Outside the courthouse, local media reported the outcome. There were no public protests, no angry crowds, just one image repeated across news wires. Rachel's college graduation photo, placed at the base of the courthouse steps, now surrounded by a small bouquet of sunflowers. In the months that followed, Pepperdine University awarded Rachel a posthumous master's degree in clinical psychology. A nonprofit trauma support center in Ventura launched a family therapy scholarship in her name. Her children, now under the guardianship of her parents, began attending school again, quietly with structure, supported by counselors trained in child loss and trauma response. This case didn't end with a twist. It ended with accountability. No one tried to turn it into a lesson. But for those who worked it, and those who lived through it, it became a stark reminder that violence rarely looks like chaos. Sometimes it moves in silence, through custody exchanges, through routine texts, through unchecked entitlement. And the only thing that stops it from happening again is when we stop ignoring early signs. Rachel Castillo did everything right. She stayed civil after divorce. She followed the court's custody orders. She rebuilt her life in plain sight, and it still wasn't enough. Cases like these don't just ask what happened. They ask what protection really looks like when the threat isn't a stranger, but someone who once called you family. In the end, stories like Rachel's aren't just about justice. They're about prevention. If you've stayed with me this far, then you know this isn't just a crime story. It's a warning. I've seen how quickly love can turn into control and how silence can hide danger. If you're in a situation that feels unsafe, trust that feeling. Speak up. Ask for help. And if someone around you is trying to set healthy boundaries, respect them. It might save a life. What do you think defines real safety in relationships today? How would you protect someone you care about? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. If this story resonated with you, or even if it didn't, share your view below. If you found value in this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next true story that matters.